California salmon. So that's an interesting subject. Now, we're on a little bit of a rebound right now. There's an opener this year. It's been closed for the last 3 years. In fact, for the opener, I'm going to be out there doing some filming, so I'm looking forward to that. And in fact, for the second opener, August 1st, I believe it is, right? At up the barge hole. So we'll see what happens there. So good times, you know, got some salmon to fish for in the river, a little bit of a rebound. So the thing is now, can we keep the momentum going? Now, one of the things that's in the news these days is Shasta Lake, Shasta Dam, and how the managers who control the release of water from the dam, they put out their plan for how much water is going to be released throughout the summer and fall. And it looks like that there's going to be so much water released that by the time the fall run, king salmon get up here and build their reds, and then the fry are ready to hatch, the water temperature coming out of the dam might be too high for that to hatch to be sustainable. Now, some people would say, you know, the temperature thing really isn't that big of a deal, and this is just a ploy to prevent water from being sent down for agriculture and other uses down south. So, you know, that's just a different argument for a different video. But what, you know, messing with temperature might be a way to mess with success rate or success of the hatch rate. But a really good way to do that is to leave the reds high and dry. You know, have the water nice and high when the fish come in to spawn, and then right before the eggs are ready to hatch, drop the river level and leave them with no water. Just pull the rug out from underneath them, and that's what's been going on for the past many years. So we'll see what happens this year. But if we're talking about, you know, salmon-related issues, I think it's really important that you have some historical context of the natural history and the cultural history and how we got to this point. So if you can stick with me for a little while, I'll give you the cliff notes on, you know, my version of the history of all this and how we got here. And it's a really interesting subject that I would, you know, encourage anybody to go into more detail on than what I'm going to, you know, try to share with you here. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the Sacramento Valley at one time would turn into basically a big lake. All right, this is a Mediterranean climate. It's wet in the winter and dry in the summer. So in the wintertime, the Sacramento Valley would flood, huge, big time. And I had an old neighbor, Bill Leiter, and he was telling me stories about how he would ride the paddle boats up the Sacramento River. So we're going back probably in the 20s, late teens maybe. And you know, how in the summer the paddle boats would go up, you know, follow the river because that's where the water was. But when if there was a big flood that year in the winter, they'd just go straight up the valley. They didn't worry about where the river channel was. And I remember telling them about how they hit or almost hit a tractor that was underwater, and the only thing sticking up was the smokestack, the exhaust of this tractor. So you can imagine just how much water was out there. Now, that's just the perfectly natural way that the Sacramento Valley was. It was a big wetland for most of it, half the year maybe. That's why early on, very few people actually lived down in the valley. Most of the towns and development was up in the foothills a little bit. But people understood the value of the land, and it didn't take long before some very big projects took place to control the flooding in the Sacramento Valley. So before that, though, remember that right after the Civil War, a lot of people migrated from the south and southeast or southwest, and they were, the Southern Democrats, basically. They were the people kind of escaping the aftermath of the Civil War, and they were still kind of upset about that. They did not want any involvement from federal government. They were very much a states' rights type of group. So these landowners that were taking chunks of land in the valley, they didn't want any help from the federal government to begin with. So they tried to do everything on their own. along with the state. And so each individual landowner maybe tried to build some dikes, levees, do this or that, canals here and there. And it was just a mishmash of different plans. And so one guy would build a levee or a dike here, and it would cause the water to flow over into his neighbor's place. So, it was just a big mess. It didn't work. So eventually this company, the Sutter Bypass, Sutter something company, it organized itself to where, okay, we're going to drain these wetlands to make them useful for agriculture and cattle or whatever. And they got funded by Mr. Armour out of Chicago, big meat packer in Chicago. So this company, along with some outside financial aid and the state, started on the Sutter Bypass, which is there today. It's a big floodplain where water can be controlled. The release of water out of the Sacramento River is controlled into this area to help prevent flooding elsewhere. And they did eventually get some help from the Army Corps of Engineers, which would be the federal government. And that was just sort of necessary. They kind of, I think, capitulated and said, okay, yeah, we need some federal help here. So after that was done, that was in the 20s. Then in the 30s, they built the Yellow Bypass. And that was more of a federal project, the Army Corps of Engineers. So when you drive between Davis and Sacramento, now you're driving over a big bridge that goes over the Yellow Bypass. And that, again, is just a huge controlled floodplain. And it's been extremely successful. It turned a bunch of, how many millions of acres of unusable land into some of the most productive and fertile land in the world. So that's what happened there. The Sacramento Valley no longer flooded to where it did in previous history. And on top of that, at the same time as all this was going on, back, late 19th century, early 20th century, the mining up in the hills, right? They were using water, big giant water guns, hydraulic mining. And, the Feather River Canyon, other places, but huge amounts of rock and debris coming down out of the hills into the valley. And so that was a big problem. So on top of everything, though, the salmon did still try to survive. Now, there are 4 runs of salmon that the Sacramento River is unique to. We've got the fall run, the late fall run, the winter run, and the spring run. That's sort of a unique Sacramento River situation there. So the fall run's the biggest, and that's what's going to start coming in. They're coming in right now. And they would spawn in the main stem of the Sacramento, Feather River, Yuba River, some of the tributaries, but not very far up. They wouldn't venture way up into the mountains. They'd come up this far, though. This is Cow Creek, South Fork Cow Creek, which is a tributary of the Sacramento River. And, it's up a ways from the main Sacramento River, and they would come here, and right over here a couple of years ago, I saw a pair of spawning salmon. And this used to be a really fertile salmon creek, and it's not anymore, but there's a few survivors. But, the fall run was kind of a short run, you can call them. They wouldn't go way up into the hills. So the late fall run that comes in, usually about November or so, they are a little bit bigger. They're kind of like the June hogs up in the Columbia River, whereas our fall run kind of be like the Tules, maybe, as far as their habits of spawning. So the late fall run, another very similar to the fall run, but they would take the same type of spawning area. And then after the late fall run, here comes the winter run. Now the winter run is built more to go upstream. They wouldn't spawn in the mainstream of the Sacramento River, like around Redding and Red Bluff and all that. They would want to go farther up into the Pit, the McCloud, the Upper Sacramento, and some of the other tributaries that come down into the Sacramento Valley. So that would lead to the spring run, which would be kind of like the Upper River Brights on the Columbia River. to where they're going, in the Columbia River, they're going all the way to Idaho. Well, our fish here in California would go way up into the far reaches of the Pitt River and the McCloud and so forth. They'd go even farther than the winter run, and they would hold over in deep pools with that spring-fed water. So even though it's really hot, the water where they're holding over is nice and cool. So it would work out pretty well for them. Now in those 4 runs of salmon, even though they were distinct runs, they kind of rely on each other. Each run of salmon supports every other run of salmon. Because after salmon spawns, it dies, right? So that carcass is deteriorating. It's feeding giving nutrients to the river, feeding the bugs, and actually feeding the fish. I mean, the fry and smolts will come and actually pick on the dead carcasses, and that's a really good source of nutrition for the whole ecosystem of the river. So that's why it was important that there were these multiple runs of salmon, because they would kind of all feed each other. I did a video a while back, an episode with a guy named Robert Dunn, who's a very long-time guide here in Sacramento River and real active in the NorCal Guide Association. But anyway, he described this connection between the runs of salmon as like spokes on a wheel. So you got 4 spokes on this wheel, and you knock one out, well, that weakens the whole wheel, and you knock 2 out, and that really makes the wheel weak, and so forth, where we're just degrading the whole system by not having full runs of all 4 runs of salmon. And you got to throw the steelhead in there on top of that too, because they relied on the salmon also. So what happened to the salmon? Well, 1943, right, the Shasta Dam was built. So that knocked out the spring run and the winter run to a large degree. So what's the relationship between eliminating the flooding of the Sacramento Valley and the 4 runs of salmon in the Sacramento River? Well, after the eggs hatch for these runs of salmon, they would eventually be washed down into the Sacramento Valley, and that's where they would grow up and get strong before they would head out to the ocean. You can imagine floodwaters throughout the valley, especially down in the Yellow Basin and Sutter Basin, which were kind of like the low points in the valley. And that the water in the main stem of a river, Sacramento River, or whatever river, is colder than the water that's flooding out over the grasslands. And as that water warms, as it floods out of the main channel, what happens? Well, you get a lot of life. You get a lot of plankton, a lot of food, really good food. So these floodwaters would just be teeming with all kinds of great food for these baby salmon. So they would just eat, get big and strong, and they'd have a really good shot at making it down to the ocean and being successful. So these days, we're asking these fish to live in the main stem that's usually, well, in the winter and spring anyway, it's cold and somewhat sterile. There's not a lot of food in there for them to eat. So they're at a real big disadvantage to begin with to grow up strong and to be healthy and ready to go to have a good survival rate. So that's a huge problem. I did an episode years ago with some researchers at UC Davis that are taking rice fields right down there in the Yellow Bypass area and letting the salmon out into these flooded rice fields to kind of mimic what it was like back when that area was just being naturally flooded. And it was amazing to see all the food that's there. And so that was interesting thing that I think needs to be, paid more attention to in the future about, how we expect these baby fish to grow up and be, survivable. How are they going to make it, besides all the other things that are going on, but just to give them some good nutritious food to begin with, because they don't have the 4 runs of salmon to depend on, to help sustain their nutritional needs. So that's a big problem. So because the natural environment of the Sacramento Valley is so different than it was originally, And the runs of salmon are in such a different place than they used to be as far as their ability to go up the rivers and have access to all the different streams, and just the reduction in the amount of usable spawning grounds they have. I mean, take a look at the Yuba River in particular. That was turned completely upside down by the gold miners. You know, it's a completely different river than it was originally. So maybe there's some good spawning gravel there still, but it's a whole lot different than it was originally. You can see that if you just go up in the lower part of the Yuba River. You can see all the tailings, and it just, you can see something happened there, and it was a big deal. So we've got to, be aware of what's changed and how we need to think about our role is managing this change. So we can hope that they can come back on their own in a natural sort of way, and that'd be great. But you can't expect the fish that needs to go up to the cold water way up the McCloud and the Pitt River to be successful, to do that without being able to get up there. So they don't have their original natural environment to survive in, and none of the salmon do. So we need to be thinking about that, I think, as far as ensuring that we're giving these fish a reasonable chance at survival. And that's what's going to ensure that fishermen got a reasonable chance of going fishing. So we're going fishing here in Sacramento Valley here pretty quick. And hopefully we'll be doing that next year and the year after. We'll see what happens.